some initial contact that I made with Mrs. Richardson at an event at the yacht club that I was attending. It was a fundraiser for the women's shelter Sakate House. And I was sitting chatting with her about things, and we started talking about family and travel, and I asked about her accent, and she started to tell me a bit about her story. There wasn't time to hear it there, and I thought this would be the perfect venue for her to come and tell us all her fantastic story. I think often in a large family, in a large, prolific and sort of active, busy, and somewhat famous family, the matriarch is often overlooked. She's the one doing most of the work, as we all know, because that's how the world works, is the women. And I think sometimes this woman that you're about to meet, I have come to know to be a formidable woman, and she's had a wonderful, wonderful story to tell, and she's here today to share it with us from Winnipeg. So let's give her a warm welcome. This is part one, and then after lunch we'll be hearing part two of the story. So we're really looking forward to this today.
I'm 93 years old, and in this story, I take you into the world of a wartime child who came to Canada after the Dunkirk evacuation and returned to England to serve 3.5 years in the WAFs when I was 17. I was born in 1925 in England, and at age 13, I went to a girls' boarding school called Benenden in Kent. World War II started in 1939, followed by the fiasco of Dunkirk, when France had collapsed and the Germans had pushed the English troops back to the beaches. The Navy were able to save many of the soldiers, who were able to get on the boats and taken to safety in England. But their guns, tanks, and big vehicles were left on the beaches. The British government thought that the Germans would invade England immediately, with the British capitulating as quickly as the French did. Now, as we look back on the huge preparations needed for a successful D-Day, we realize that there was no way the Germans could have planned and had equipment ready for a large, successful invasion of England, immediately following the quick downfall of France. Thinking the invasion was imminent, the British government thought if they could not save England, they would try to save some of the children by sending them over to Canada and the United States. My 3 older brothers were in the armed forces and probably would have been killed by the Germans or made prisoners of war. Hoping to save one of their 4 children, my parents had 24 hours to decide to have me join the Benenden School group who were going to Canada. When I said goodbye to my parents in London, they and I thought that had the Germans invaded England, we would never have seen each other again. About 15 of us and a teacher took a train to Liverpool, and we boarded a ship which was crammed full of children and mothers with small babies. We slept in our clothes on double bunk beds, carried life jackets wherever we went, had daily lifeboat drills, and a strict blackout was enforced. Our ship and another liner, filled with children like ours, were escorted by a naval vessel, but after 2 days, it left our 2 ships on our own to cross the Atlantic as fast as we could go without the protection of a convoy or naval escort. A few days later, the other liner was torpedoed, and our ship was not allowed to stop to pick up survivors, as we would have been easy prey for the German U-boats. The ship sank and many children were drowned. When news of this reached England, parents decided to keep their children with them to face whatever the future would bring, and the government plan to evacuate British children was shelved. Our ship entered the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but until we passed Quebec, the blackout was enforced. Sailing up to Montreal with no blackout was magical. Seeing the lights along the shore and, for the first time, the wonderment of a fiery display of northern lights. We spent the first few days in a big house on the St. Lawrence River, once owned by the past Governor-General of Canada, Lord Athelstan. It was extremely hot and humid, and we dragged our beds onto the big balcony. No one had warned us about mosquitoes. And the next morning, our faces were swollen from mosquito bites. We were then sent to a boarding school south of the St. Lawrence, and as it was summer holidays, there was no school, and little was done to keep us busy. We were bored, hot, and homesick. Family friends invited me to stay in Toronto, and later we went to a small cottage on Wolfe Island near Kingston. In September, the Benonu girls were sent by train on the long journey across Canada to Winnipeg to attend Riverbend School, where we boarded. Compared to the strict English schools, we felt we'd arrived in heaven, as we were allowed to wear our own clothes and makeup in the evenings. And on weekends, we were allowed to go downtown to see a movie and visit friends. I was 15 and put into grade 11, but most of the girls were 16 and 17. They had boyfriends and dates and were socially beyond my English boarding school experience. However, they were a kind and friendly group, and we became good friends. My English teacher opened up the magic of words to me and started my love of writing. We had no homes or families to go to during holidays, but one of the grade 11 girls' parents invited me to spend Christmas with them. My own family were not able to send a present because of the war, and our letters were censored. My parents were only allowed to send money for my schooling, so I had no spending money, but a business friend of my father sent me a very small monthly allowance for stamps, writing paper, toothpaste, and a few essentials. And if there was any money left over, I was able to buy a ticket to the movies. In June 1941, we graduated in Westminster Church, and to be like the other girls, I was given a long white dress and carried a bunch of red roses. That evening, there was a graduation dance, and those of us from England had blind dates from a boys' school. I was thrilled to receive a corsage from my blind date, a boy who a little bit later was killed over Europe serving as a pilot in the RCAF. The day after graduation, I was informed that my eldest brother, Anthony, who was a British Naval Fleet Air Arm pilot, had been killed. I was just 16, heartbroken, and felt very much alone with no family nearby. The kind parents of one of my school friends, the Lees, invited me to go with them to their camp on Falcon Lake. In those days, a long, rough gravel trek off the old highway to Kenora. To a young girl from England, to spend days beside such a beautiful lake deep in the forest of evergreens and silver birch, and seemingly miles from anywhere, really was like heaven. We swam and picnicked and fished and explored the lake in small outboards with a bunch of teenagers, which was a wonderful antidote to sadness and began my process of healing. While I was at Falcon Lake with the Lee family, they decided one day to drive into Kenora. It happened to be Treaty Day, so the streets were full of people. As I was told in those days, the treaty money had to be collected in Kenora. We walked over to Cameron's Point to visit Betty Cameron, who had shared a bedroom with me and another girl whilst we were boarders at Riverbend School in Winnipeg. We passed a number of Indigenous families, the first I had seen since I arrived in Canada. I remember seeing some of their babies in papooses propped up against a wall or bridge, which intrigued me. I was told many of them lived on reserves far away from Kenora. I realize now that I knew nothing about these Indigenous people and nothing about their history or how they lived or even what a reserve was. A couple of weeks later, I caught the train in Kenora to visit friends who lived in Almont and Arnprior, about 40 miles out of Ottawa. In the 1940s, formal education ended after grade 11. I found out that I could take a business course at Angus Business College in Winnipeg and continue to stay at Riverbend School, now Balmoral Hall. The teachers despaired over my English handwriting and spent months teaching me penmanship. I ended up with a spidery hand full of loops and squiggles. On my first spelling test, I rated minus 50 marks. I hadn't had a spelling lesson since I left kindergarten. Within a few months, I became reasonably proficient in spelling. In February 1942, I was offered a job at the British Ministry of War Transport in Montreal, and I lived with the family of a business friend of my father. I was just 17. The office was in the Windsor Station, and the department dealt with secret information concerning the movement of ships and convoys. In my free time, I volunteered at an aircrew hostel, mingling with the men who'd been trained as aircrew under the Commonwealth Air Training Plan in Canada. The men came from England, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and a few came from the USA. They were waiting to be sent over to England. I, too, was anxious to go back to England to do my bit in the war effort, and my office boss was able to arrange my passage. I took the train to Halifax, arriving in the blackout, and the next day I was driven to a small, grubby old French freighter, which had been commandeered when the French capitulated. I shared a small cabin with 4 women who had been working as cipher clerks in Bermuda. We had to wear our clothes 24 hours a day and carry our life jackets wherever we went on the ship, and we had lifeboat drill several times a day. The rest of the passengers were Merchant Navy officers who had been torpedoed off North America and, after a period of recuperation, were being sent back to join other merchant ships. The first 2 days out of Halifax, the sea was dead calm, and our ship fell into place with many others of all sizes, which made the huge convoy. Naval vessels roamed up and down, helping to protect us. A convoy could only go at the pace of the slowest ship. My job with the British Ministry of War Transport had involved keeping track of all the convoys leaving Canada for England. So I knew how many ships in each convoy had been sunk by the Germans. Scary knowledge. A big storm developed, and the sea became very rough with huge waves crashing over the ship's bow. We clutched at railings and rope lines, which had been strung up for safety on the wet decks. The dining room stewards gave up trying to lay the tables and would bring each of us a plate laden with food and a fork. It was so rough and the visibility was so poor, we did not see the other ships in the convoy. The storm had its good side. The rough seas made it impossible for the German submarines to fire their torpedoes accurately. We were the only convoy to sail across the Atlantic at that time without losing a ship. Only when we came into the lee of Ireland were the Germans able to attack, and sank 2 ships which had fallen behind with engine trouble. We docked in Liverpool, and I spent the night in a hotel before taking the train down to London. I must have looked a strange sight with my big school trunk, suitcases, and a pair of skis, which had been a gift from my father's friends in Montreal. In London, I miraculously found a taxi which drove me across London to Waterloo Station, and I took a train down to my hometown, Guildford, in Surrey. Due to strict wartime secrecy, I had not been able to inform my parents I was coming back to England. You can imagine my mother's shock when I phoned her to say I was just 7 miles away. She used some precious petrol, gas, in her car to pick me and all my stuff up at Guildford Station. I was 17 3/4 and had crossed the Atlantic twice in wartime, but I was still not old enough to join any of the forces. During the war, English girls who had not volunteered by the time they turned 18 were conscripted into the forces or the land army to work on the farms, or nursing, or into factories making munitions and things needed for war. I worked at my father's evacuated office until my application to join the Women's Auxiliary Air Force was accepted 6 weeks before my 18th birthday. A few days after Christmas, my friend Eleanor and I met in Reading for the train ride to Gloucester, where we and 300 other girls were crammed into the back of big trucks and driven to the Royal Air Force WAF Induction Center. We were told to strip and given a medical examination for head lice, rashes, and other unpleasant things. We were shown to our sleeping Nissen huts and given a meal in the mess. The next day we were woken at 5:45 by a trumpet blast, issued our uniforms and identification dog tags, given the first of many shots, attended lectures, and was shown how to make our military beds, and taught the rudiments of marching in a platoon. We were told useful things such as the official issue of toilet paper per WAF was 1 sheet per person per day. We learnt to buy a newspaper and use that. The Nissen huts, set on concrete, had curved corrugated sides and roof. There were double bunk beds for 30 girls, and we each had a small chest for our uniform clothes. In the middle of the hut was a stove, fueled by chunks of coke, which would burn out or clinker during the night. The wash basins and lavatories were in a separate ablution hut, and once a week we could have a bath in the bath hut. No one seemed to know about showers then. It was just after Christmas, and it was cold, damp, rough, and miserable, and the food was dreary and in bulk. We were made to scrub floors and clean baths, lavatories, and basins. I think I survived thanks to the discipline taught me living in a Spartan British boarding school with their strict rules. At the beginning, some of the girls felt they could not take it any longer, and they walked the 5 miles into Gloucester, only to be rounded up by the military police and brought back to the induction center. We were under martial law. That meant we could not just decide we did not want to do this anymore. After a week, we were sent by train up to Morecambe on the coast above Liverpool for square bashing. We lived in small rooming houses in row upon row of houses. Our strict landlady fed us 3 meals a day, and we were allowed 1 bath a week. We had 4 weeks of daily lectures on Air Force routine, were given more shots, and were shown how to wear and use a gas mask. We were made to go into a shed full of gas and put on our gas mask and be in the shed for several minutes. We had daily instruction on marching and learning how to salute properly. We were divided into the various trades, and as I had volunteered, I chose and was accepted to be a transport driver. Why this trade? I thought that however awful a place one might be sent to, as a driver, with a bit of luck, I would get occasional jobs off the airfield or WAF base, which would relieve the tedium. It was a sanity-saving choice. In the evenings, we sometimes went to the Palais de Danse, or to see some hairy old musical, such as Desert Song, performed by ancient actors who were too old or not good enough actors to be part of the ENSA, the official military entertainers, who helped keep up the morale of the troops. It was pretty awful. Waiting for our transport driver course to begin, we were sent to a bomber station at Pershore near Stratford-on-Avon. We were turned on to scrub and wash the NAFI floors and do odd jobs. We received our first pay, 2 shillings a day, and even in those days, it was not much. After I became a transport driver, I was given an extra 2 pennies a day as danger money. I used to say the danger was not driving on the roads in the blackout or during an air raid. The danger was fighting off the overly amorous pilots and ground crew. In our free time, we walked or hitched into Stratford to have a beer at the Black Swan pub near the theatre. It was spring, and the many fruit trees in this area were in bloom. There were station dances and dances in Stratford, and a huge supply of young pilots and air crew. I dated a Canadian pilot officer and received my first proposal of marriage. Life in the WAFs was looking better. we had 10 weeks on our transport driver training up near Blackpool. My first instructor told me, "Remember, everyone on the road, including you, is a fool, and always give way to a fool." Good advice, and in 75 years of driving, I have only been in 3 small accidents. 2 when I was rammed from behind. We drove 1,500 weight trucks and finally 3-ton trucks, and some were given permission to drive 10-ton trucks. In those days, there was no power steering or brakes, and to change gear, we had to double declutch, which was heavy work in the big trucks. We learnt to drive in convoy and in the blackout. We changed tires and learnt simple mechanics and how to do 2,000-mile and 10,000-mile inspections. Occasionally we had to take a turn on latrine duty, cleaning the huts, washrooms and lavatories. There were no garbage bags. We had to take bins full of soiled sanitary towels and throw them in the hot water furnaces and clean the bins. It taught me there is not a job I consider too low to do. I was posted to the 11 Group station at Kenley, just south of London. The flare path along the runways was changed by hand every time the wind changed course. We had to watch out for fighter planes taking off and landing, and we had to be ready to swing the van off the runway. Nowadays, the lights are built into the runways and are changed by an electric switch. We drove pilots and ground crews and doctors, the garbage, store trucks, and occasionally some high-ranking officer. We took turns scrubbing the NAFI canteen floor, and once I encountered a pilot officer also scrubbing on his knees. He had lost his nerve flying sorties over Germany and had not been able to complete his tour of duty. It seemed terrible punishment for someone who had flown on bombing missions over enemy-held territories, and who was to say 1 tour or 2 tours of flying on raids was what he should have completed. Another man I met doing this kind of menial work was a monk who had left his order when war was declared. The girls I met in the Transport Division were nice enough and from a wide range of social levels. Some came from the slums and swore like troopers, and a very few, like me, had been educated in a private boarding school. I survived my share of heavy teasing. The male drivers often had been truck drivers before they were conscripted, and they drove the huge, heavy trucks considered too difficult for us girls, the long trailers that carried fighter planes, and the cumbersome fire trucks. I was posted to Fighter 11 Group Station, Hawkinge in Kent, which was 4 miles inland on the South Downs up from Folkestone. And I spent the major part of my war service here, or at its nearby satellite Lymm. The steep side of the Downs had mock gun sites with huge wooden guns painted to look like real guns. After Dunkirk, the army was desperately short of military equipment, and it was hoped that the German planes would be fooled into thinking these were the real thing. Hawkinge was the nearest Allied airfield to German-held France, and had been badly bombed before I arrived there. It also was in the range of the cross-channel guns, which occasionally did damage, including hitting the water tank. It was a World War I airfield, a small grass field shaped like a saucer, with no hard surface runways. Fighter squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires with English, Canadian, Polish, Norwegian, and American pilots, and occasionally Naval Fleet Air Arm pilots with naval planes with folding wings used for aircraft carrier duty would fly in to take turns on active duty. There were air-sea rescue planes which would try to save the pilots who crashed into the sea after bombing raids or fighter sorties. Bomber planes, which had been shot at and hit at on raids over Germany, came limping back with one or two engines gone on fire and tried to land on this small airfield, which was the nearest airfield on their return. Many failed, and there were some terrible crashes on or just off the airfield. Hawkinge was not designed or big enough for 4-engine bombers. I remember one crash in which a crew member fell from an exploded plane onto a shed just outside the station. I was driving an ambulance and went with the chief medical officer to the site. This was my initiation into death at close hand, and it was horrifying. Another time, I was on a duty call, and a badly damaged fighter plane burst into flames and crashed a fiery mass. The pilot was rescued, but he was terribly badly burnt and was screaming, a sound none of us will ever forget. The medical officer took him in the ambulance to sick quarters and gave him an injection. The screaming stopped, and the pilot had eternal peace. Mercy killing was indeed merciful. Another time, a German bomber crashed into a wood. I drove the medical officer, and we walked through the woods looking for survivors, not knowing if some of the crew were alive and able to shoot at us. We discovered several bodies and loaded them into the ambulance. It was terrible and vital work. One grew up fast in wartime. Hawkinge was also responsible for the temporary advanced airfields on the Romney Marsh, where English, Canadian, and American planes were kept for D-Day. Miles of wire netting were laid on the soft, grassy marsh fields to help the planes take off and land. Pilots and ground crew were housed in tents, and the planes were concealed under camouflage nets. I had to take messages and people down to these advanced airfields, often in the middle of the night. Locating them in the dark in the blackout was extremely difficult. A clear moonlight night helped, but often the marshes had mist and fog. When the war started, all the signposts were taken down at the road intersections. If you stopped to ask the way, you would be told nothing, or the wrong way, as the locals thought you might be German parachutists. Cat's eyes were later installed on the roads, which helped show the curves in the dark or fog. After the Allies had secured enough territory in France and forward airfields had been located and repaired, these fighter squadrons flew over to France and operated from their new landing fields. The Romney Marshes were returned to sheep, which grazed on grass growing up between the netting. At Hawkinge and Lim, the fighter planes were hidden around the edges of the airfield. We drove the pilots out to their dispersal huts when they were on call to scramble. flare path was constant work with the changing winds. I drove the signals officer all over the Kent coastal area, visiting remote direction-finding sites. Radio contact from them was made to help pilots know where they were, and these were also listening posts for German planes approaching England. These sites would be tucked away on a down or behind a farmhouse. I came to know the area very well. We drove along sunken lanes, which in the spring were a mass of primroses, violets, and cowslips. Many radar sites were on the Romney Marshes, an area full of history, and close to Winchelsea and Rye, which years ago had been seaports, but are now surrounded by the Romney Marsh. The signals officer had trained in Manitoba in the Commonwealth Air Training Program, and one day he proposed to me as I was driving him on duty, even though I'd never had a date with him. I suppose today that could be termed sexual harassment. One morning, I had the privilege of driving Group Captain Douglas Barder. He was a South African who joined the Air Force as a fighter pilot, even though he had 2 artificial legs. I drove him to Ramsgate Harbour, where he caught a boat to France. Later, he was shot down over France and taken prisoner of war by the Germans. He continually tried to escape until the Germans threatened to take his legs away. Now, one of those unbelievable but absolutely true weird stories that happened during World War II. The German fighter pilot, war ace, Major General Galland, had heard about and admired Douglas Barder and arranged to take him out of Barder's prisoner of war camp for lunch. Their friendship continued and grew. Years later, Barder and Galland attended the first Commonwealth War Pilots reunion in Winnipeg, when my husband Jim was Canada's Minister of National Defence. We had a dinner party at our house for the VIP pilots and high-ranking Air Force officers, and these 2 famous veteran pilots, Barder and Galland, were both in our house. We drove the bus that collected the officers from the officers' mess each evening. Driving the bus was easy, but fighting off the amorous pilots was hard. The transport officer took pity on us when the Polish squadron came to Hawkinge and chose a man to drive the bus. Sometimes I drove pilots to Canadian Dr. McIndoe's plastic surgery hospital in East Grinstead. His team operated and rebuilt pilots and others who were badly burnt or smashed up. Men with no eyelids or a smashed nose or other terrible injury were given skin grafts, and many had a massive operations. A new crash victim would be placed beside a man who had half his face rebuilt. Positive therapy and normalcy were the goals. Visitors could come anytime. The men were encouraged to go into East Grinstead and have a pint at the pub, and the townsfolk treated them normally, despite their gross looks. Patients joined the elite Guinea Pig Club. It was an inspiring place. Some of us helped rebuild the chapel, which had been bombed. We had classical music sessions. We helped organize station dances held in a hangar. before D-Day, Hawkinge was the frontline station because it was the closest to France, and we were able to persuade the famous American Glenn Miller and his band to play at a dance organized by our station but held in Folkestone. I provided a dozen precious eggs from my mother's hens for a raffle. Later, Glenn Miller's plane disappeared over the sea and he was presumed drowned. One day, I was summoned in front of my WAF commanding officer, who told me that my second brother, Rafe, had been killed. Rafe had been in command of a motor torpedo boat, which was blown up by the Germans. In an encounter near the Dutch coast, I was given compassionate leave and went to comfort my mother. Her second son killed. Life was tough and cruel. And that's all for this morning.